well, certainly a better understanding of what is going on in Poland. Indeed, more information would probably help. The fact is that journalists and even historians are as lazy as the rest of us and just as prone to stereotyping people and nations.
Piotr Stefan Wandycz, the Yale historian, reflected once that what to the Poles was the Polish cause, to the outside world was the Polish question. To be sure, he was writing in 1980 about the successive European conferences of territorial partition, Vienna in 1815, Versailles in 1919, then Yalta and Potsdam in the immediate post-war. But this axiom sounds perhaps more prescient than ever since Poland's much-touted entry into the pacified end of history after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Speaking of a new Polish question sounds provocative at best, and at worst a parti pris for the national conservative persuasion of the Law and Justice Party currently in government. And yet one cannot fully understand the political cycle of the last 15 years without a level-headed re-examination of the imperative of Polish sovereignty and self-determination that had been for centuries so menaced by enemies east and west. Whether we like it or not, these sentiments are again front and center in the political imagination of broad swaths of Polish society. Our episode this week will pierce the partisan veil imposed by the liberal internationalist consensus that has, by casting Poland as a backsliding, retrograde, proto-authoritarian state, distorted our common understanding of the uniqueness of the Polish experience. Enjoy the episode. We are delighted to have with us two distinguished scholars, practitioners, both in a way and most of all esteemed observers of Polish life. Both have a unique outlook that comes with having resided for great lengths of time in sort of the Anglosphere and particularly the UK. Both were born in Anglo-Saxon countries, but they've distinguished themselves really by their commitment to a better understanding of the Polish experience, and we're so delighted to have them both. Adam Zamoyski, you are a Polish-British historian of worldwide renown. Your many distinguished works include, just to cite a few, Poland, A History, which, as I understand it, you wrote in sort of the waning days of communism and then published a revised edition in 2009. You've also written a wildly successful biography of Napoleon that came out in 2018. A couple of other books that are worth mentioning. Phantom Terror, Political Paranoia and the Creation of the Modern State came out in 2015. Warsaw 1920, Lenin's Failed Conquest of Europe came out in 2008. And these are just to cite a couple of your monographs on Polish history. And on the other end of the line, Marek Matraszek, you are the chairman of CEC Group, which is the leading government relations consultancy, not just in Poland, but in the broader V4 region and expanding beyond. Before launching CEC, you'd spend much of the 1990s as a political consultant, an advisor across the sort of the democracy promotion network and a range of political groups from both the US and the UK. You were born in the UK. You read politics, philosophy, and economics, and a master's of philosophy in Russian and East European studies at Magdalene College at Oxford. And you also did some post-grad work there. So we're really thankful for to both of you for coming on to discuss Poland. And we speak on the heels of a very polemic saga that is seen among other issues of contention, the issue of LGBT rights, the so-called LGBT free zones drew the international spotlight recently with a junior minister from France visiting. The amended Holocaust memory law has obviously earned the rebuke of a number of international NGOs, and this is not to mention a number of other ongoing sticking points, contentions around issues like abortion, big tech, so-called democratic backsliding. So just to get us started, I wondered if we could perhaps starting with Adam and then turning to Marek, where do you think that Europe's understanding of the Polish experience stands at the moment in your judgment, and do you think it could benefit from a deeper anchoring in historical scholarship, the kind of specific and very close contact that you both had with the country over the years? Do you think that a finer attunement to mainstream Polish society could benefit our current predicament in terms of the relationship of Poland to the wider EU and the wider West?
Well, certainly a better understanding of what is going on in Poland. Indeed, more information would probably help. The fact is that journalists and even historians are as lazy as the rest of us and just as prone to stereotyping people and nations. Um, if you actually look at the extent of interest of, say, the British press in Italian affairs, uh, Italian stories only ever come up when there's a question of corruption in government or the mafia. Um, in the world press, most stories about the United Kingdom, the majority have something to do with the royal family. British press coverage of France has a lot to do with food, sex scandals, and indeed presidential corruption. Because these are the things that trigger and wake up a journalist as he's wondering what to write about or which story to follow. And in the case of Poland, well, the stereotypes are yes, the Poles are nationalistic, they're recalcitrantly Catholic, they're inevitably they're always anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth. And so the only stories that tend to be that the foreign press tends to carry about Poland relate to these tropes. Which is not to say that these things don't exist and that there aren't these stories, but it tends to be heavily weighed in that area. And the other voices to be heard in Poland and are not heard abroad because, on the whole, the journalist interviewing people in Poland wants a good, meaty quote from somebody who will meet those stereotypes rather than from some young person who will actually raise a different questions and make the journalist and indeed his audience have to revise their opinions, which nobody likes to do. Uh, the fact is that, yes, there is a residue of, well, Poland is a nationalistic society in the sense that it's a very patriotic society. And because it has gone through some difficult moments, it announces that patriotism perhaps a bit more loudly than the others. But I don't think that actually the Poles are much more nationalistic than the British, taken in some, or many other countries. Um, and the extent of Catholicism in Poland is also overstated because although it is extremely important and has been extremely important, it is not now that major a, a factor in the life of the majority of the population. Um, and but of course the stories about it are picked up because they figure in politics, largely because we have a rather bizarre political scene at the moment in Poland. And as for anti-Semitism and things, well, actually, there are more anti-Semitic acts that take place most of the time in places like France and England and Germany. And in France, there are always cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, and synagogues being desecrated and attacked, which doesn't happen in Poland. So these things, there is a one-sided reporting. The question of the LGBT and the abortion thing, which of course is a bit of a mixture because two things have been lumped together. Well, the argument on abortion is as strong as in the United States as it is in Poland, and Poland is very divided on the issue. The only reason why it's come to the fore is because the government, wishing to please the Catholic Church and get some more votes on board, promised to tighten the law. As for the LGBT issue, it's a curious one, because actually, speaking to most people, and I'm at the moment living in what would be termed by most Poles the most backward and godforsaken part of the country, and the most obscurantist. Everybody seems to be perfectly happy with anybody choosing any sexual orientation they may like. What they don't get the point of is it being politicized. And I would venture that from every conversation I've had in England, that is exactly the same view you'd get in throughout the majority of society, who feel the whole issue is rather boring. But of course, they're terrified of coming out and saying so, for fear of being labelled as not woke enough. Whereas here, people happily express their views. The fact that it's been turned into a political thing is because the church, which is trying desperately to hide and to push into the shadow the problems of sexual exploitation of minors by various members of the clergy, and the attempts to hide it by the hierarchy. They're going on about LGBT as a kind of terrible and threatening ideology, and a whole lot of silly local councillors trying to please their local bishops have enacted these ridiculous zones, which and most people here just hoot with laughter at the whole idea. It's just not an issue, and I suspect they will all be quietly abolished soon. So. I think that the issue is much more rounded. It's much more complex, and actually, I'm surprised at how many people are absolutely open as far as any sexual orientation is concerned.
Yeah, and Marek, you're obviously committed full time, I guess, to explaining Poland as well, to in a way from the private sphere. Would you somewhat agree with Adam's diagnosis in terms of different conversations taking place and some level of distortion? Do you find that in your work?
Well, I mean, I agree completely with Adam, who really said most of the key points. And so I can only add just from my own perspective, because I started to travel to Poland. Well, I actually started to travel when I was a very young boy in the 60s. But when I was politically aware in the 70s, and especially the 1980s, I spent almost every summer in Poland, and more during the later half of the 80s, when I was coming here in supporting the underground. I mean, Poland. So I view Poland from a perspective of someone who is actually knows the country from a very young age, was actually and knows it from a very interesting perspective, which is that of a very ordinary visitor visiting very ordinary people at a time when Poland was closed off to the external world. Poland after after 1945, of course, became a terra incognita for most people in the West. Nobody traveled here. There were very few journalists here. There was a small diplomatic community. And there was very little opportunity for academics, commentators, journalists. This was before social media, of course. So it was a very narrow, there was a bottleneck, as it were, of people of information. And so there was very little experience of Poland after 1945 and until 1990 by what you might call today the commentariat. Everyone had opinions about Poland, but very, very few people had actually come to Poland and experienced the realities of life under communism, talking to ordinary people, and getting to understand the mindset and what made people tick. And what happened in 89, 90, when obviously everything changed and democracy came and travel emerged and Poland opened up, there was a tendency really to look at what was happening in Poland again, not from the perspective of the ordinary Pole, but from the perspective of one's own presuppositions about what reality was here. So, immediately after 1989, there was this view that Poland was joining the liberal world order, that all the things, the famous Fukuyama thing, where the history was ending, Poland was making a leap into democracy, liberalism, rule of law, plurality, democracy, and so on, which was a very simplistic way of looking at it. Even I fell into that trap myself because I was very close. I am really still close to conservatism. I was working with Lady Thatcher at the time after she had retired, and there was a tendency even on the conservative side to romanticize what was happening in Poland. That Poland was moving into a Thatcherite nirvana. Private property was here to stay. Liberal free markets, everything that was a carbon copy of Thatcherism was on the banner of every politically conscious, was being held aloft by every politically conscious Pole. And of course, neither of these perspectives were really true. And I still think to this day that there is a lot of what is going on is people looking at Poland through their own almost ideological lens and trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and really not understanding Poland because they don't spend enough time here to understand the views of ordinary people and what is really going on. And Adam, as a historian, you will know that the real truth is never as simple as it appears to the external observer. You have to go in and look at the details of what is going on. So as you drill down to all these controversial issues that we've been discussing in this podcast, whether it's the Holocaust memory law, whether it's abortion, anti-Semitism, all of these things, you realize LGBT-free zones. As you get into the detail of these things, you realize, well, they're actually not LGBT-free zones. They are local councils who have passed motions pledging fidelity to the Polish constitution. And the only reason why people talk about LGBT-free zones is because there's an LGBT activist who goes around pinning these signs up and taking photographs and putting it on Twitter. So people think there are LGBT zones. Abortion. Yes, was there a little bit of maneuvering by the government to get the Constitutional Tribunal to rule as it did? But there are many legal scholars and people who are actually fairly liberal on abortion issues will say actually this on a literal reading of the Constitution, this judgment of the Constitutional Tribunal, which again, to go into detail, doesn't entirely ban abortion. It limits the application of abortion to damaged fetuses, which is defined very broadly as including Down syndrome children. Anyway, so again, as you go down into the detail, you realize that the reality is much, much more complex. And I think this is really the key problem because Poland, as we know, is a very, very complex country, ruled by complex emotions with a very complex history. It's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to understand Poland through a single lens. Now, that classic problem that's been around for the last 25 years, I've seen is certainly here. I personally, if we can just digress a little bit, I mean, I think part of the problem that I've seen particularly is how Poland is reported on. And if I look at the journalist community that are in Poland today, they're very different to the journalists that Adam and I knew from back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, there are the Roger Boys of these worlds, Tim Garton-Ash, the number of others, Chris Babinski from the Financial Times. These were people who really either spent a lot of time here, who really were historians, who actually really looked at the country very, very deeply. Today's journalists, without mentioning names, but most of the Western correspondents here come from a very different breed of journalism. And often I think actually journalism is a secondary instinct to many of them. Journalism understood as understanding nuance, trying to be as understanding as possible, objective as possible. It comes second to an ideological mission. And these are often, frankly, ideological activists who just happen to have a career as a journalist. And they try to move their journalism, as it were, into the ideological mindset. Just anecdotally, there's an interesting little app that's just come out that if you key in someone's Twitter account, the handle, you can see what news they are absorbing, whether it's left, centrist, or right. And I spent an hour or so keying in all the names of the journalists. I mean, I thought perhaps I should have had better things to do. And what really emerged is the reporters here themselves live in a center-left bubble and absorbing news from left-wing or centrist, no conservative sources. So the way Poland is reported, from the word go today, there is an inbred bias of reporting, which instinctively finds things like religious faith, traditional family morality, traditional virtues, by definition to be suspicious. And there is then the move then to interpret what goes on through that critical approach rather than a sympathetic or understanding or you don't have to be an apologist, but certainly a critical understanding of Poland is missing. And it's a conflation of, as I say, these two, the long-term thing of Polish isolation for many, many years from Western observers, and the modern phenomenon, which is not limited to Poland, of course, of a journalist community which is intellectually biased in a very clear way.
And this is all super useful, Marek, and it really segues into kind of what we're trying to achieve with this episode. And you see Adam's own works have looked at kind of the Polish experience through history and the feeling of being besieged by neighbors and kind of the indomitable character that has been opposed to the outer menaces of East and West. And I wonder, how you've both experienced the new Polish political landscape. You were just getting into some of this, Marek, a minute ago, and describing kind of the Poland that you experienced and lived and worked in on both sides of the fall of the Berlin Wall, from the underground and then in democratic Poland. And it seems like where the sort of the nationalist persuasion that was ascendant perhaps in the early 2000s with a segment of the kind of legacy dissident institutions turning into the Law and Justice Party. And I wonder, to what extent is the Polish people experiencing some of these bones of political contention as an issue of sovereignty, as a reiteration of the same old contentions around whether the Poles are able to self-determine and have their own capacity to their sovereignty within their borders. So I wonder if that's you think a fair depiction of how Polish society, in particular the center right and nationalistic right voters are looking at these issues.
Well, again, I think this is where we have to be a little bit self-critical, because although we may define ourselves as being conservative, I think it's a bit of a stretch to define the majority of Polish society as being conservative, because if you actually look at whether all sorts of sociological studies of social attitudes, or whether you look at the way voters vote, I mean, it is pretty 50-50. I mean, the best example was obviously in the presidential elections that we had here last year, in controversial circumstances because of the COVID situation, but nonetheless fully democratic, and people actually went out and vote. A massive turnout. Perhaps I think it was almost the biggest turnout almost ever in Polish electoral history. And the President Duda really just squeaked it. It was a very, very tight race, and it was 52-48. It's a very, very, very familiar percentage to anybody looking at Brexit, of course. But of course, he did win. But it was a very tight race, and it was a very polarized race because both he and his opponent, Mr. Trzaskowski, very clearly articulated the two worldviews. One was robustly conservative. President Duda, on the campaign, did a run, nationalist themes, Eurosceptic, very sovereignist, and Mr. Trzaskowski being the classical international liberal with all the right phrases about individual freedom and pluralism and so on. So it was a very clear choice, and it was only narrowly won by Duda. And since then, if you look at the impact of the abortion dispute, which I think in retrospect, I think Mr. Kaczynski, the leader of Law and Justice, will come to regret that it was, as it were, brought on, because what the result has been is a massive falling away of support for the ruling party among young people, who actually usually don't vote, but so perhaps it doesn't matter. But this time, I think they will be persuaded to vote at the next election. And if you look at the voting patterns, particularly among the young, they are moving to the centre and to the centre left. So it's an erosion of the conservative majority. I'm not saying that Poland will go the same way as quickly as Spain or Portugal or Ireland, where you had a dramatic falling away of support for the Catholic Church, ending almost in a very dramatic secularization in many cases of those countries. But I think the long-term erosion of the conservative majority has started. And I think perhaps a little bit later we can discuss to what extent the current government is helping or hindering that process. But I would not say that the conservative, well, let me put it this way, the political emanation of the conservative vision, which is represented by the Law and Justice Party, I think is eroding. There's probably still there is a majority, but I think it's not now. It's been politically demobilized. If you, again, without going into boring old cephalological details, if you look at the election polls, there has been a falling away. About a million and a half voters who voted for Duda are not expressing an interest in voting. So they've been demobilized. Sort of what you might call the silent majority has become extremely silent, because they are not feeling that the Law and Justice Party adequately represents their political interests. And I think that's the main challenge now of any conservative movement, is to what extent that that demobilized part of the electorate who don't actually like some of the things that are happening at the governmental level can be remobilized to support an openly conservative political movement. But I fear that in slow motion, Poland is slowly moving on the track of secularization. It's inevitable. You can see it in all sorts of statistics involving church attendance, which is dramatically falling, and I suspect COVID will also deepen that trend. Participation in religious education in schools, the general standing of the Catholic Church, and Adam mentioned the various paedophile scandals and all this sort of thing, which is terrible, and the reaction of the institutional church is very, very unsatisfactory in many cases. They are not moving quickly enough to expose and to apologize for some of these disgraceful incidents and stuff in the past. So I fear that there's a combination of factors here eroding that conservative majority. So I'm not actually a conservative triumphalist. I don't go around saying, well, Poland's, flag waving and we'll always be winning our conservative position. It's not happening. It's eroding, unfortunately, and it's and before our very eyes, to a large extent.
How does a historian look at some of the recent political cycles that we've seen in the election that Marek was commenting on last summer with Duda's narrow win? It seems like your history of Poland that came out in 2009 was a revised edition of an earlier kind of sweeping history of the country, and I wonder what kind of outlook you had already then in 2009 when the Kuczynski brothers were already the Law and Justice Party as a whole was already sort of ascendant, and what kind of outlook you have now.
And just to add something to what Marek said, of course, I agree with most. This is very boring because I'm agreeing with most of what he says. It's very sensible. The election of Duda actually, in if you really look at it, it was a terrible defeat for him because there was Duda, the incumbent, with a vast electoral machine behind him. Huge efforts were put in by all the politicians, sitting politicians, lobbying, touring the country, banging the drum. Many of the clergy were either obviously or quietly telling people to vote for him, whereas young Trzaskowski was unknown to many people. He'd only been entered himself as a candidate a few weeks before, and he had no political machine, or a very poor political machine behind him, and he only just lost. And indeed, there were, because of the COVID thing and people voting abroad, there were quite a lot of votes of the foreign Poles living abroad lost, who mostly voted for him. So it was actually a shattering defeat for Law and Justice and their candidate. You see, I think the real problem about the Law and Justice Party is this, that when they started out, partly because the Kaczynski, who is no longer with us, was a more stable and a slightly different person to his brother. When they started out, they did actually represent, to some extent, what you or I might call a conservative outlook, and a genuinely patriotic one. But since then, the exercise of power and the way they use power has transformed the party, and I think, and obviously the tragedy of the Smolensk accident, where one of the twins died, and most people would say the more level-headed one of the two, and the subsequent very difficult psychological state, to put it lightly, into which the surviving twin, who is the ideologue of the party, was cast by this very unfortunate event, have had an effect. And the problem, what I think you have to remember, is that these people were brought up under communism, and the modus operandi is entirely Bolshevik. They operate through committees and strong arm discussions in which everybody has to conform, and anybody who doesn't conform is out. And the way they behave has changed, actually, has affected their policy. Hence the the attacks on the rule of law are not deliberate attacks on the rule of law. They honestly think that they are tidying up the messy situation in which a government can't act as it wishes to, even though it's been elected to, because there are wretched judges saying that they can't do this or they can't do that. And so they feel, well, we must change this law or make such changes that that the judges don't put sticks in our spokes and obstacles in our way, because after all, we are trying to create a new society. And this is the other aspect of the problem, is that originally you could have said that they were conservative in the sense that they stood for family values, for Polish sovereignty, for the Polish national tradition, and regarded the church as one of the pillars of Polishness, all of which was absolutely fine. However, they have really, because of the way they rule and because of their attitude, they have tried to, and because they were brought up under communism, they are imbued with this idea that government is there to create a society and to create a kind of paradise on earth, and to tell young people how they should behave, and to instruct society how it should behave. It is a perfect Soviet system. And actually, they are anti-individualistic, they're anti-capitalist, they're anti-elitist, they don't like private property of any sort, they loathe the former landowning classes and what they regard as the former ruling classes. So, when people call them right wing, I've ceased bitterly laughing. But the fact is, it is a complete misnomer, because what they have actually done is they've sort of returned to type, and they've morphed back into a kind of a mongrel Bolshevik mode. And indeed, their version of Polish sovereignty and nationalism is taken straight out of the textbooks that the Polish People's Republic put together in the 1950s in order to orient Polish society in a certain way and make it more malleable. So it is a very complicated thing. And so while they're supposedly conservative, what they're actually trying to conserve, is something that's gone. They're trying to preserve a kind of, there was one thing that people, there is a certain nostalgia you come across occasionally in Poland and throughout the former Soviet bloc for the old days, because there was a comfort zone in that nobody had any money. People had lousy jobs where they pretended to work. The government pretended to pay them with Toy Town money. You couldn't buy anything you wanted. You couldn't travel. But the great comfort was that nobody else could. And so everybody was in the same boat, and that created a certain solidarity, and it was a bit of a balm for a lot of frustrated people. And these people, and I think particularly the main ideologue of the party, is actually, probably subconsciously, trying to put back the clock to a sort of imagined kind of Soviet Poland with Catholicism. And, not even Polish traditionalists are buying that. And most of the clergy aren't buying this either. My local parish priest, very, very careful because they're terrified of the bishops, but they're horrified at what's going on. the way that the hierarchy is behaving, as are most of the religious in the orders. The fact is that the hierarchy is of very low, consists of people of a very low intellectual caliber and educational caliber. They are a sort of the way that the Catholic Church has been run in Poland for a long time, unfortunately, means that those who want to be and behave like apparatchiks get to the top and become bishops and cardinals. And the lower ranks are terrified of them. So there's a lot going on, as Marek pointed out, and it's bubbling under the surface, and I think it's going to come out in not the too distant future, and it's going to change Polish, or I think it's going to surprise outside observers, put it that way. Unfortunately, a lot of damage has been done. And as Marek says, an awful lot of young people have just turned away from the church and won't come back. And I agree that I don't think we're going to see an Ireland or a Quebec or a France, because the religion is far more firmly anchored in the people and in the national psyche, and indeed in the way of life. But I think there is going to be a great change, because actually this government is not conservative. It's not conserving anything anybody wants to conserve, except itself, and it's been propounding a very mongrelized version of Polish history, identity, and of Polish society.
So I want to focus on the issue of Holocaust memory. And I'm French, so I think that's mostly my understanding of Holocaust remembrance comes from my personal experiences, but I think the French comparison is interesting and useful here. France's old historiography of resistance was mostly unchallenged until Robert Paxton's book Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order in 1972. Before that, there was an understanding that France was largely a victim of Nazi aggression. Then in 1995, you've got French President Jacques Chirac, who does a famous Veldiv speech in which he recognizes the role of France in the deportation of Jews. Poland is in a different situation. Unlike France, it had no collaborationist government. Its resistance was more substantial in terms of demographic weight, and there were more Jewish life saved, for example, through actions of the Polish resistance. That said, there are also local examples of collaboration between Poles and the German occupiers in denouncing Jews. And those smaller local examples seem to have been largely redacted from official narratives, especially under this new amended law on this issue of Holocaust remembrance. Does this complex role of Poland, and the fact it was the location of many of the death camps, Nazi death camps, does this situation condemn Poland to be in a kind of weird grey area of an international remembrance politics? And are you hopeful that those fences can be mended if a memory law goes unchanged?
Well, it is a very difficult one, because, there was no collaboration at any official level, not just because of the Poles' refusal to do that, but because there was no attempt by the Germans. The Germans didn't occupy Poland. What they did was to invade the territory of what had been Poland, and to remove every vestige of the Polish state and turn it into a no man's land in which they could do which was a kind of an legal and state desert in which they could do what they wanted to, and that's why the camps were placed there, because the whole place was turned into a kind of a terrifying place where everything was closed down. The government was closed down, schools were closed down, cinemas, theatres, newspapers, printing houses. The whole of every aspect of life was just shut down, and the country was carved up, and people lost. Because they lost their nationality, nobody had any human rights left at all. So that there is absolutely no comparison between the conditions in Poland between 1939 and 1945 and the conditions in, say, France or Belgium or Holland or any other occupied country. Having said that, the problem about the Holocaust at the moment is this, that, and of course, during the war, yes, the Germans rounded up the Jews. Most Poles were more worried about their own safety and they had enough to worry about keeping fed and safe than to worry about anybody else. And yes, lots of people did help. There was a fantastic criminal market in making money out of denouncing Jews, either by taking money from the Nazis for denouncing a Jew, or blackmailing Polish families who are hiding Jews. This happens. People are not nice, and war makes them even nastier than they are in normal circumstances. But coming back to the point at issue, it's this, that after the war, the whole of the history of the war was manipulated by the new government. And the war was entirely written up as a heroic struggle of Poland and her Slav sister, Russia, against the filthy German invaders. And it was an entirely Polish-German war, in which the Jews simply didn't figure in official histories. I mean, they were an absolute sideline, to the extent that Auschwitz, which was turned by the communist authorities into a sort of showcase, had, I don't know what it's like now because I haven't revisited it for many years, but it had in those days a pavilion dedicated to every nation whose nationals had suffered there. There was not a pavilion dedicated to the Jews. So there was the Poles, there were the Czechs, there were the French, and the fact that these people were in large measure mostly Jews was actually glossed over. And so there was this great narrative where, again, Poles felt they had lost everything in the war, but they'd come out with their honor safe. They had resisted the Germans. They were the only nation in Europe that hadn't collaborated, and so on and so forth. And they had fought from the beginning and to the end, and so on. And it was really only after 1989 that a number of things happened. One was that some of the truth of what happened, alternative versions of the Second World War, began to come out, and the story was no longer quite as black and white as it had seemed, which was upsetting. Then rather unpleasant stories began to come out again about how various anti-Semitic incidents by Poles and activities of various Polish people. These were rather over-egged by some historians who found it a good sensational niche. And particularly one historian who has virtually made out that the Poles killed more Jews than the Germans, which And so that began to enrage people, not surprisingly. And the Poles, as a result, are very touchy about this. The the whole, this idiotic law passed by the present government is a sort of, it's just a sort of the wrong. It's just typical. They have a talent for passing laws that don't make any sense and that usually achieve the exact opposite. Um, and it's derided by most Poles if they even know about it. It enrages, as you say, NGOs and Jewish organisations outside, and I'm afraid there's some quite a silly sort of arguments between various historians who see this as a good platform on which to shine on one side or the other, which is not helpful and frankly quite juvenile. And so it's Polish society has had to go through some quite painful moments when they were confronted with the past, as have many societies in Europe. On the whole, they've done it very well. And for instance, the history of the Jews in Poland in Warsaw is one of the most remarkable institutions and tells a story with sensitivity and frankness, and one which few other nations can achieve. And as you know, well, the French question on collaboration is one thing, but the French question on the treatment of the Jews is, still not really hasn't been satisfactorily aired, nor indeed attitudes in some of the Allied countries, or indeed the United States refusal to take in refugees, or even want to talk about the Holocaust. So I think the process has been understandably hurtful to much of Polish society, which has reacted in many cases, overreacted. The government has passed an idiotic law which is meaningless. And it's thoroughly unhelpful, and the whole issue should be left to historians and possibly historians who have fewer axes to grind than some of the ones who are presently making so much noise about it. And the question of lingering anti-Semitism in Poland is a different one, and is largely a political one, and is distinct from this particular.
Yeah. And Marek, you're in the business of translating legislative activity that goes on in Poland to the outer world. What's kind of your read of this particular law, and how do you think it'll eventually hurt Poland's image worldwide?
Yeah, well, I mean, this whole issue is a minefield, isn't it? And it's one that, as you know, as we saw in all the other issues that Poland's been belaboured with on the controversies of the last few years, there are a lot of people in Poland who, unfortunately, are making it very easy for outside observers to criticize Poland. I mean, the law that you mentioned is one thing, although I think, I mean, at the end of the day, it was amended, and so it's now not the case that it's that the state can charge you. It allows civil cases to be brought, but it doesn't. But it only was amended after a very quiet but very firm campaign from the U.S. administration. And I think this was something which when the law was originally drafted, because the drafters of the law are very parochial and somewhat provincial, they had no concept of how this would strain Polish-US relations. This was at a time, bear in mind, when President Trump was in office, and there was a very deep, there was an ongoing uh, uh, close dialogue between both presidents. The governments were moving together, all sorts of things were happening. And yet this came along to completely, um, perhaps to threaten to undermine the entire Polish-US geopolitical relationship. And that was why the law was finally amended. But I, I think one thing that's, if you look at the current government and the current people in charge and Kaczynski, those who know Kaczynski know, he comes from, if you look at his background, and that, of course, also of his late brother, I mean, they were brought up in what would today be defined as a center-left intelligentsia family in Warsaw, in Żoliborz, where the whole PPS, the Polish Socialist Party tradition, was very strong. And both Kaczynski brothers, resolutely rejected. They were never involved in any sort of anti-Semitic statements in their past. There are a lot of politicians, by the way, who are active in the opposition to the current government, who in their youth were actually involved in openly anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish political movements. So it's a very much a patchwork history when you look at it. And Lech Kaczynski in particular, as president, was very, very committed to Polish-Jewish dialogue. He spent a lot of time investing in the relationship between Poland and Israel. And the current ambassador to Israel, Marek Magierowski, is an absolutely first-rate person who has the rare talent of combining Polish patriotism with a very deep commitment to forging Polish-Israeli relations. I mean, Jaroslaw Kaczynski is and any Polish, well, particularly a leader of a party that claims to be a conservative party, is really trapped, because on the one hand he's trapped with the attitudes of the fringes of the political movement that he is heading, and also, in political terms, trapped by the potential rise on the even further right. I mean, there's this group called Confederation, which is not necessarily anti-Semitic, but it has a very strong nationalist streak to it. So, Kaczynski as a politician, whatever his private views, has to, maneuver through these both these social forces and these political forces. But there's no question that he himself is absolutely free of any sort of anti-Semitic, and he's certainly not allowed any anti-Semitic tropes to be used as a way of legitimizing his government. And certainly, I mean, he hasn't engaged in some sort of vendetta against Soros the way Orban has in Hungary. And remember, we often talk about the Polish right as being somehow still infected with the bacillus of anti-Semitism. But under communism, and I think Adam referred to this or hinted at it, it was actually the communists themselves who, for many years, tried to directly or indirectly legitimize their rule through promoting anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish propaganda. I mean, the entire 1968 campaign against Jews that led many of them to emigrate from Poland. There were purges of the army and of the administration, of the party of people of Jewish origin. This was a communist attempt at legitimation. Now, of course, it raises the very prescient question. Well, there was a reason why those purges were undertaken, because it was felt that that would gain the party popularity, and that would indicate that there was and there is a sort of almost a folk suspicion of Jewishness amongst the Polish people. That was certainly the case, I think, after the war, which almost went into a deep freeze in relation to attitudes towards the Jewish people. And there was, I think, a strand of the Polish population which, although not overtly anti-Semitic in the way the Nazis were, had a sort of a folk suspicion of the Jewish neighbor. And this communist way of legitimization um, was a method that was openly or indirectly, and even during martial law, it re-emerged to a certain extent. And I think, to give Poland credit where credit is due, we're talking about, the reflections of the French, through from the 70s onwards about their own Vichy past. I mean, after 1989, 1990, I remember there was a very, very strong attempt to rebuild bridges with the Jewish community. The bulk of the Polish opposition movement that emerged after 1989 and took power after 1989 came from liberal Warsaw intelligentsia families who, had no truck with anti-Semitism. In fact, some of the leading members of the opposition were Jewish themselves. I mean, Adam Michnik, for example, and others, who has done a lot, or who try to do a lot to rebuild Polish-Jewish dialogue. So the history of Poland is very much a patchwork. It turns out that it was not only the nationalists who were anti-Semites, the communists were as well. And after 1989, the bulk of it was not the case that Poland has been ruled over the last 30 years by a Jew-baiting conservative, hierarchy. It's been largely run over the last 30 years very broadly by sort of a center or center-left, or a centrist or a center-right political consensus, which has never had any truck with anti-Semitism. So the current controversies that you're seeing, I think, are a combination of what Adam has pointed out as being the rather ham-fisted attempt by some people associated with the government to protect Poland's reputation through these very badly written laws, not with any malevolent purpose, but through, I think, as I was saying at the beginning, ignorance of how these laws or these attempted laws would be received in the West and in amongst Western politicians. And I think, to be fair to Poland, I think there is, I wouldn't say there's a sort of a get Poland attitude amongst some journalists, but there is, and I see it as an exaggerated tendency to take something which is a true issue and to try and sort of explode it into something which is very far from the truth. So Poland is not, run by, contrary to what you might read in the New York Times, is not run by a Jew-baiting government, insistent on whitewashing history. It's rather run by a fairly incompetent authority with little sensitivity to the subtleties of Western politics and perhaps oversensitive to its own national history. But there's very little mendacity involved. I think that's the key point. There's very little deliberate anti-Jewish sentiment. There's stupidity and ignorance at worst. So I think one has to be objective about these things, and that's the real challenge for historians. I mean, ultimately, the story of the way the Polish people behaved during the war, those who did good things, those who did bad things, is not really a reflection on the Polish the Polish identity. It's a reflection on humanity and the human soul, and to the extent to which it can be either corrupted or heroic, one or the other, when faced with the sort of the existential threat that German Nazism presented to the Polish people. And I don't think the Polish people behaved worse or better than anyone else would have behaved in their circumstances. And perhaps, as a testament to the Polish spirit, if you can use that phrase, they perhaps behaved better than other nations would have in the same circumstances.
This is a wonderful point to end on. We're so grateful you took the time, and this has been a wonderful discussion. This is really the kind of conversations that we exist to hold. So we're so thankful that you made time for us, and this has been really a fascinating contextualization of what's going on in today's Poland in the broader scheme of history and
So, Adam and Marek are out. Jorge, what did you make about this special episode on Poland?
Well, you see, when I told our guests that this is one of the more worthwhile episodes we've done and I usually say that when it's really a worthwhile episode, and some of these episodes are getting more interested as we go into our second season. But this particular time, I think I really meant it. I think this episode has been a really good blend of kind of political analysis. Translating Polish politics through a very objective lens is my sense of what we've just heard, but also combined with the sort of deeper historical anchoring that I think we should be aiming for in this podcast. And I was really glad that we were able to bring together Marek, who's dedicated really much of his life. I mean, not only in the 90s when he was in a liaison for the sort of the Thatcherite Reaganite democracy promotion network, but even in the waning days of communism, he was working with the underground, and I think he was heavily involved with Roger Scruton's Jagiellonian Trust. And I need to fact check this, but I think he was heavily involved in deploying. Jagiellonian Trust was this organization that Roger Scruton set up across Central Europe and the captive nations. And what they did was they availed dissident groups with printing equipment, books, a lot of books that were banned in Poland were, stealthily, I guess, secretly shipped to Poland and distributed to dissident groups so that they could build their reading groups and kind of have conversations around the free market, but also Polish history. So I think Marek has a really, really interesting angle and perspective, having been a part of that and now working in more sort of the private sphere, but still kind of translating Polish life to international observers. And Adam, what can I say about Adam? He's really one of the most authoritative historians who has worked for decades on Polish issues. I'm really, really curious to hear you on kind of what you made of the whole comparison with France. I think a lot of what Adam said was on point. There's no the very issue. I mean, our idea of kind of setting the two countries against one another was a little provocative, and that was just for the sake of drawing this comparison, saying, look, there was an official cover-up for decades in France, not in the sense of caviarder l'histoire, not in the sense of redacting out or silencing narratives, but simply in the sense of, de Gaulle had this idea that in order to build a sovereign, powerful, democratic France, you had to, first of all, foreground the resistance, right? You had to put out a strong narrative whereby his government and the resistance domestically and the liaison between the two was really the driving force of the French spirit, and that whatever collaboration happened was on the margins of French life, and that the French heart really was somewhere else. It was in the resistance, and it was in London. So I'm really curious to hear you on kind of what you made of Adam's comments and Marek's comments on the Holocaust issue.
So what I made about their comments, I thought was interesting, because usually when people will criticize the Polish government, especially over the past few years, it's usually because they suspect some kind of ulterior motives, some kind of evil scheming government, which is has all those awful qualities to it. And while that's always part of kind of political discourse, I do think they made an interesting critique, especially Marek towards the end, of the Polish government, Adam as well, of course, essentially arguing that this wasn't a government which was motivated by dark ambitions. It's one that is simply not politically very astute. It doesn't understand the weight of the laws it tries to push. And so in some sense, it seems to fall in trap after trap. And it's really playing into the narrative, kind of more simplistic narrative about how Poland is retrograde and backsliding and all that stuff, which has to be taken with a grain of salt. I think more than anything, what this shows is this is a government which has some things which you can definitely contest, and we might even talk one day about the Clermont-Bonne incident in Poland, about the LGBT zones. So I think there are some kind of controversial things here and there. But I think more importantly, it's a government which seems to fall in every single PR trap that is set on its way. And I think that's something we have to keep into account.
And it was so nicely captured with Marek's turn of phrase. He seemed to frame these the clumsiness of the government in terms of competence and not so much in terms of substance. And what I thought was so important in Marek's framework is that at the end of the day, when you're running a country like Poland, which again, 40 million people, huge economy, really a powerhouse in European geopolitics, you when you're running a country like Poland, you've got to govern for the Polish people. Yeah. You are the Polish government, and I really appreciated how Marek spoke of the Peace Party not being so attuned as one could hope to the subtleties of Western politics and Western sensibilities, but that is merely the cost at which its own version of Polish politics comes. It is primarily governing for the Polish people, and that is also, I think, a huge correction that we have to apply to the current narrative, which is that the current narrative, the overwhelming perception of Polish life that you read in some of these mainstream Western journals and papers is that the Polish government is hateful, it's resentful, it is governing against sexual preference minorities, it is governing against the sort of liberal-minded youth, and so I really did appreciate that, even though I totally see Marek's point about the PiS government laying the groundwork of its own falling out of love with the Polish youth. I mean, it is a fact that Polish youths have overwhelmingly voted for the left liberal candidates in recent elections. But all of these points of context, I think, were incredibly helpful.
Well, I do hope you enjoyed this episode on Poland. We've been meaning to do Eastern Europe a lot more, so keep tuned so you can listen to the future episodes we do on Eastern Europe, or Central Europe. I know Eastern Europeans are offended, or Central Europeans are offended when we call them Eastern Europeans, but I think you can call Poland Eastern Europe. But anyways,
that's a very important. I actually like how you've sort of. I think the current framework at the moment places that borderland on Poland's eastern frontier. So you would consider the whole of Poland right now to be Central Europe, although of course historically the borders have been moving so many times that it's hard to. But
let's say Central and Eastern Europe then.
Yes.
To keep it safe. But anyways, if you like the show, feel free to like, subscribe, review, all these little things which really help us to make sure the show reaches many more of you. And, puts a smile on our face when you see your reviews. Before we go, next week is Easter, so we'll be taking a short Easter break. But don't worry, we'll be back right after with plenty more episodes. So enjoy your Easter break and see you soon.